He was 130 pounds, cross-eyed and nearly blind. And one sentence in a magazine made him the most expensive new artist in the history of the recording business. $600,000. The largest advance any label had ever paid a solo musician at the time. He was 25 years old, and he had been signed off the strength of a single paragraph. 3 months later, he walked on stage at the biggest festival the world had ever seen, played for 65 minutes around midnight, and turned in one of the wildest sets of the entire weekend. Then his performance was cut from the movie, cut from the album, and buried for 40 years. He produced 3 records that won Grammy Awards. Not one of them had his name on the front. He made his childhood idol a Grammy winner. He made the blues respectable to a generation of rock kids. And he was nominated again and again across 4 decades and walked away empty-handed every single time. An addiction nearly killed him at 26. He beat it, then spent 2 more decades being slowly hollowed out all over again, until a stranger with a guitar walked into his life and pulled him back from the edge. He titled one of his comeback albums, "Still Alive and Well." It was not a boast. It was a status report. Every date here is documented, every number is sourced. The advance, the Grammys, the buried tape, the hotel room in Switzerland. This is Johnny Winter's story. And the cruelest twist in it didn't happen until 2 months after he was already gone. Number 1. The white-haired kid in Beaumont. John Dawson. Winter III was born on February 23, 1944 in Beaumont, Texas, an oil town full of wildcatters and shipyard men, where nobody had ever seen a child quite like him. He was born with albinism. So was his younger brother Edgar, 3 years behind him. No pigment in the skin, the hair, the eyes. Snow white from the day they arrived. And in 1940s Texas, that made them targets. Johnny's eyesight was so poor, he was effectively legally blind, with a crossed eye that never tracked right. He had to hold a book inches from his face to read it. He couldn't see a chalkboard, he couldn't catch a ball. And in a tough, segregated oil town in the 1950s, 2 Snow White boys who couldn't see straight were exactly the kind of different that other kids punished. Johnny later spoke about the staring, the cruelty, the constant sense of being looked at. Kids in Beaumont did what kids do to anything different. They made his life a daily test of survival. Music was the one place the staring stopped. His parents put a clarinet in his hands at 5, then a ukulele. By 10, he and Edgar were singing Everly Brothers harmonies on a local children's television show. 2 white-haired little boys nobody could forget. Then he found the guitar, and he found the radio. A Beaumont disc jockey named J.P. Richardson, who the world would soon know as the Big Bopper. Through that radio came the blues, Muddy Waters, B.B. King, Bobby Bland. A 15-year-old half-blind albino kid in Texas decided that was going to be his life. That same year, 1959, he formed his first band, Johnny and the Jammers, with 12-year-old Edgar on keys. They cut a single called School Day Blues for a Houston label. He was 15, and he was already on a record. But the boy who couldn't see across a classroom was about to be seen by everyone. He just needed the right 38 words. Number 2. The paragraph that started a war. On December 7, 1968, Rolling Stone published a piece about the Texas music scene by writers Larry Sepulvado and John Burks. Buried in it was a description of a local guitarist almost nobody outside Texas had heard of. The line read like a dare. If you can imagine a 130-pound cross-eyed albino with long fleecy hair, the writer said, playing some of the gutsiest, most fluid blues guitar you have ever heard. Then enter Johnny Winter. That was it. 1 paragraph. But it landed on exactly the right desk at exactly the right moment. A New York club owner named Steve Paul read it, got on a plane to Texas, and walked straight up to Johnny Winter to ask if he could manage him. Within weeks, the word was out among the major labels. There was a freak of nature blues player in Texas, and somebody needed to sign him before everyone else did. What happened next was not a contract negotiation. It was a feeding frenzy. RCA, Atlantic, Elektra, and Columbia all came circling at once. 4 of the biggest labels in America, fighting over a near-blind kid from an oil town who had never had a national hit in his life. The bidding climbed into territory no new artist had ever seen. And the night it all got decided, Johnny wasn't even in Texas. He was standing on a stage in New York, about to play the single most important song of his career. Number 3, $600,000. In December 1968, the guitarist Mike Bloomfield, already a star, already one of the most admired blues players in the country, invited Johnny up to sing one number during a show at the Fillmore East in New York. Just one song. A courtesy to the kid from Texas everyone was suddenly whispering about. He chose B.B. King's "It's My Own Fault." He tore the room apart. The crowd that had come to see Bloomfield went home talking about the Albino. And sitting in that audience were executives from Columbia Records, who had just had a massive hit with a Bloomfield record and were looking for the next thing. Within days, it was done. Columbia signed Johnny Winter for an advance reported at $600,000, described at the time as the largest sum ever paid to a new solo artist in the history of the recording industry. Sit with that figure for a second. In 1969 money. For a blues guitarist with no chart record, no crossover hit, no name recognition past the Texas state line. $600,000 handed to a kid who 2 years earlier had been playing roadhouses for gas money. He rushed into a Nashville studio and cut his major label debut, simply titled Johnny Winter, with his Texas trio, bassist Tommy Shannon, who would later anchor Stevie Ray Vaughan's Double Trouble, and drummer Uncle John Turner, plus his brother Edgar on keys and sax. It hit the top 25. He was a star before most of America had heard a note. The hype was enormous. The expectations were impossible. And almost immediately, people who had nothing to do with his success started showing up with their hands out. But before the vultures landed, there was one weekend that should have made him immortal. And it almost erased him instead. Number 4, Midnight at Woodstock. In August 1969, Johnny Winter took the stage at the Woodstock Festival in front of one of the largest crowds in American history. He went on around midnight and played for roughly 65 minutes, slashing electric blues, slide guitar, the works. Brother Edgar came out and joined him. By every account of the people who were there, it was ferocious. One of the most blistering performances of the entire 3 days. And then it vanished. When the Woodstock film came out and made legends of the acts who appeared in it, when the soundtrack album sold by the truckload and put Santana and Sly Stone and Joe Cocker into living rooms across the country, Johnny Winter was nowhere on either of them. His set was left out entirely. For a young artist, Woodstock on film was a golden ticket. Careers were built on 3 minutes in that movie. Johnny got 0. The single biggest promotional moment of his early career was simply erased from the record that mattered. It would take 40 years. Not until 2009 would those tapes finally surface, released on a collection called The Woodstock Experience, so the world could at last hear what the midnight crowd had heard in 1969. 40 years is a long time to wait for the world to notice the best night of your life. He'd played the show of his life to 500,000 people, and almost nobody got to see it. That pattern, being right there at the center of everything and still somehow getting left off the official story, was about to define his entire career. Number 5, the one gold record. Here's a number that should be impossible. The man who took the largest advance in industry history, who was a fixture on the album charts, who packed arenas through the early 70s, released more than 24 albums across his lifetime, and only one of them was ever certified gold. 1. A 1971 concert album called Live Johnny Winter and. That's the only RIAA award his catalog ever earned. How does that happen to a guitarist that famous? Part of the answer is ugly. The moment Johnny got hot, the people who'd recorded him cheap in the early days came crawling back to cash in. The owner of the small label that taped his first real album sold those recordings to another company the instant the Columbia deal was signed. A Houston producer who'd gotten Johnny to sign a management agreement years earlier sold his old contract and a stack of master tapes to a rival label, who packaged them into albums to ride the hype. Johnny watched his own early music get released against his will, on labels he didn't choose, in cheap packaging designed to fool fans into thinking it was new. He saw almost none of the money. By his own account, he reportedly figured only a small fraction of the Johnny Winter records sitting on store shelves were ones he had actually sanctioned. Think about that. A man so famous that most of the records with his name on them were ones he never approved and never got paid for. The fastest blues hands in America, and there was nobody in the room protecting them. He was a product being strip-mined. And the strain of being that famous, that fast, with that little control, drove him toward the one thing that nearly ended it all. Number 6, the Disappearance. By the early 1970s, Johnny Winter had everything the world said he was supposed to want, and he was quietly coming apart. He had become addicted to heroin. The pressure, the touring, the sense of being chewed up by an industry he couldn't control, it all collapsed into a dependency that pulled him off the road entirely. Friends described a young man sinking into a depression so deep that those around him feared for his life. There were no slick rehab centers in 1971. He went home to Beaumont and was hospitalized, then spent roughly 9 months at a hospital in New Orleans, fighting to get clean the hard way, with almost no public roadmap for how a rock star was supposed to do this. He simply disappeared from the music world for nearly 2 years. The momentum from those huge early albums evaporated, and the absence was so loud that when Edgar, by now a star in his own right with his band, put out a live album, he opened it by telling the crowd that everyone kept asking him the same question. Where's your brother? Where was his brother? In a hospital bed, 1,000 miles from any stage, fighting to stay alive. And when Johnny finally came back, he didn't hide what he'd been through. He named the comeback after it. Number 7, Still Alive and Well. In March 1973, after almost 3 years away, Johnny Winter released a new album. He called it Still Alive and Well. That title was not marketing. It was a man standing up in front of everyone who had written him off and saying it plainly, I went into the dark and I came back out and I'm still here. The record carried him back into the top 25. It even featured a song written specially for him by Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. The Rolling Stones handing material to the Texas kid as a welcome home gift. For a moment, the story looked like it had a clean second act. He toured, he recorded. He was the survivor who beat the thing that should have killed him at 26. But Johnny Winter never really cared about being a rock star. He'd hated the rock detours, later admitting he felt like he'd sold out his blues roots to chase the charts. There was only one thing he'd ever truly wanted since he was a 15-year-old half-blind kid hunched over a Beaumont radio. He wanted to play with the man whose records had started it all. And in the late 70s, he got the chance and gave the greatest gift of his career to someone else entirely. Number 8, The Debt to Muddy Waters. Muddy Waters was the reason Johnny Winter picked up the blues in the first place. The Chicago Giant. The voice on the radio that had reached a lonely teenager in Texas and rearranged his whole life. By the mid-1970s, Muddy was a legend, but a commercially fading one, between labels and underused. So Johnny Winter, now a star with leverage, brought him into the studio and produced a series of albums designed to do one thing. Let the world hear Muddy Waters the way Johnny had always heard him. The results were extraordinary. The 1977 album, Hard Again, then I'm Ready, then a live record. 3 of the albums Johnny Winter produced for Muddy Waters won Grammy Awards. He didn't just back his hero, he engineered a full creative resurrection, putting Muddy back in front of audiences who had drifted away. And Muddy reportedly came to think of the white-haired Texan almost as an adopted son. For Johnny, who had idolized the man since he was 15, it was the proudest work of his life, and he said as much. Now hold that image. Johnny Winter, sitting behind the glass, producing Grammy-winning record after Grammy-winning record, and every one of those trophies belonged to someone else. He had made Muddy Waters a Grammy winner. He had made the blues fashionable for an entire generation of rock fans. And in his own right, across more than 4 decades of recording, Johnny Winter had been nominated for Grammy after Grammy and had never, not once, won a single one. Remember that, because it's the wound at the center of this whole story, and it doesn't close the way you'd expect. Number 9, the slow fade. For 2 decades, the fastest hands in Texas slowly got slower. Johnny kept touring, kept recording for smaller blues labels, kept the white hair and the lightning runs. But something was wrong, and the people closest to him could see it. He had gotten clean from heroin decades earlier. But over the long years that followed, he ended up dependent on methadone and other medications, and according to those who worked with him, and to the documentary later made about his life, his condition deteriorated badly. Bandmates and friends described a man who had become alarmingly frail. He had trouble speaking. He sometimes had to be helped on and off the stage. The fastest guitarist in Texas was being slowly diminished year after year by a fog he couldn't seem to climb out of. For a while, it looked like the story would just quietly run down. A great talent fading in a haze, playing smaller and smaller rooms until there was nothing left. And then, right at the end of the 90s, a guitar player walked into the band who decided that wasn't going to be how it ended. Number 10, the man who pulled him back. His name was Paul Nelson. He met Johnny Winter in 1999, came in as a guitarist, and slowly took over running his career. Nelson is widely credited with the thing that mattered most. He helped Johnny Winter get off the methadone that had been dragging him under for years. He cleaned up the business. He surrounded Johnny with people who wanted him healthy instead of just wanting him on a stage. And the change in the man was visible. The frail figure who could barely talk started playing like himself again. In 2011, Johnny released an album called Roots, a fierce return to the blues standards that made him, with younger guitar heroes like Warren Haynes and Derek Trucks lining up to play alongside the man who'd inspired them. He was in his late 60s, decades past when the world expected anything new from him, and he was good again. Better than he'd been in years. There was a documentary in the works, a box set, a celebration of him turning 70. For the first time in a very long time, the Johnny Winter story was pointing up, which is exactly when it ran out of time. Number 11, the hotel room near Zurich. In the summer of 2014, Johnny Winter was on a European tour as part of the celebration of his 70th year. The documentary about his life had premiered. A new album was finished and ready to come out. He was, by every measure, in the middle of a genuine comeback. He played a festival in Austria. Then the tour moved on, and on July 16, 2014, in a hotel room near Zurich, Switzerland, Johnny Winter died in his sleep. He was 70 years old. His health had been failing for years. Reports attributed his passing to emphysema and pneumonia, the long bill finally coming due on a hard life and a frail body that had been fighting for decades. His representative confirmed it the next day that his wife, his family, and his bandmates were all saddened by the loss of one of the world's finest guitarists. He had played his last show just days before. He'd been clean, working, respected, and finally, after everything, content. He died believing his best work might still be ahead of him. He didn't know that the single greatest honor of his entire life was already recorded, already pressed, and sitting in a warehouse waiting to come out, and that he would never live to see it arrive. Number 12, the Grammy that came too late. The album was called Step Back. Johnny had finished recording it before that final tour. It was produced by Paul Nelson and stacked with guests, including Eric Clapton, the very rock royalty who had spent careers chasing the sound Johnny helped carry into America. It was released on September 2nd, 2014, roughly 7 weeks after he died, and the world responded the way it never quite had while he was alive to enjoy it. The record debuted at number 1 on Billboard's Blues chart. It cracked the top 20 of the main album chart. The tributes poured in. Then, at the 2015 Grammy Awards, Step Back won the award for Best Blues Album. The 130-pound albino kid from Beaumont, the one too strange and too overlooked for the official story, had finally won. After more than 24 records, after more than 4 decades, after making Muddy Waters a Grammy winner 3 times over while sitting behind the glass. After a lifetime of nominations and not one win, Johnny Winter finally took home a Grammy of his own. And then, he had been dead for 7 months. He never held it, never heard his name called, never got to walk up the aisle past the rock stars who'd built fortunes on the sound he helped carry into America. Never got to stand in front of the industry that had paid him a record fortune at 25 and then watched him be strip-mined, sidelined, and slowly forgotten and say, "See, I told you I was still alive and well." The hands that were too fast for anyone to protect finally got their due. He just wasn't there to feel it. 130 pounds, cross-eyed, half-blind, bullied for the color of his own skin in an oil town that didn't know what to make of him. One paragraph in a magazine turned him into the most expensive new artist in the business. He played the show of his life at Woodstock and got cut from the movie. He took the largest advance in recording history and ended up with exactly 1 gold record, watching strangers sell his music out from under him. The crowd at midnight heard it. The kids who learned from his records felt it. Half the slide guitar you've ever loved runs back through those white-knuckled, near-blind, impossibly fast hands. He nearly died at 26, came back, and named the album after the fact that he'd survived. He gave his hero 3 Grammys and couldn't win one for himself. He faded into a fog for 2 decades, got pulled back by a man with a guitar, and built a real comeback at 70. And then died in a hotel room in Switzerland weeks before that comeback delivered the one trophy that had always eluded him. And the official story finally got it right. 7 months too late. Because for his whole life, Johnny Winter was the best kept secret in American music. Too fast, too strange, too overlooked, too easy to leave off the page. The fastest hands nobody protected. Which Johnny Winter moment means the most to you? The early Texas fire, the comeback at 70, or the midnight Woodstock set almost nobody got to see? Tell me in the comments, and subscribe, because next time, another legend the world almost let slip away.